After a full day presenting their findings, the National Transportation Safety Board has voted on what they believe caused a deadly mid-air collision involving Flight 5342 and the Army helicopter.
That crash happened almost 1 year ago. Fact finder Dylan Domingue has been in that meeting. He joins us live tonight from Washington, D.C. with more on the hearing. Dylan?
Yeah, Mike Reichel, the NTSB has just voted on the official probable cause of the deadly mid-air collision almost 1 year ago today. To sum it up, Chairwoman Jennifer Hamady said this was preventable. Now, that first cause has to do with the helicopter route and the placement of that helicopter route that was used that night, because it was in close proximity with a runway where planes were taking off and landing regularly. Also, air traffic controllers were far too reliant on asking the pilots to create visual separation, asking the pilots to see and avoid each other. This is problematic because new findings show the pilots on the plane and the helicopter may not have seen each other until it was too late. Now, one of the most emotional pieces of evidence that was presented today that the victims, the families were shown, were animated recreations of the crash from January 29th from inside the cockpit of both the Army helicopter and Flight 5342. Additionally, the helicopter pilots may not have been aware that they were flying above the maximum altitude at the time of that crash. Now, the board just finished wrapping up, offering up those safety recommendations. There were 48 safety recommendations that were presented, a majority of those going to the FAA and being at them. Now, the FAA has come out and said that they support the NTSB's investigation. Just last week, the FAA made a permanent move to restrict airplanes and helicopters from flying in the same airspace. Now, of course, this all comes in with Congress as well. Congress plays a big role in passing some of this legislation. We saw that with the Rotor Act. Of course, Senator Moran sits on Aviation Committee. We will be speaking with Kansas Senator Jerry Moran coming up later this week to hear his thoughts about these recommendations and what's next following today's NTSB meeting.
Dylan, thank you.